Colleagues, friends, history buffs, hold on tight, because what you're about to read is not just a dry retelling of events from a century ago. This is a mirror story, a ghost story, that reflects our present day with frightening precision. It's the tale of how a great power, confident in its righteousness and strength, stepped into the icy abyss of a foreign civil war and was forever lost there. Are you ready to learn the truth about America's strangest and most forgotten war? Then get comfortable, turn off your notifications, and dive in. And, by the way, if you want investigations like this to continue, subscribe to the channel and don't dare scroll down without finishing. The main conclusion at the end will flip your understanding of world politics on its head. Let's go. The Siberian Labyrinth. How American polar bears got lost in the darkness of Russian chaos. Picture this. January 1920. The middle of nowhere near Khabarovsk. Temperature -45. Air that burns your lungs like fire. A snowy desert, slashed by the steel threads of the Trans-Siberian Railway. And here, at the tiny Romanovka station, a platoon of American soldiers is freezing. They're in fur-lined jackets with the newest Springfield rifles and Browning automatic rifles. They are the elite of one of the victorious World War powers, and they have not the slightest idea what they are about to die for. An armored train under a red flag is moving toward them. But just yesterday, these same men with the same faces could have been allies. The Cossacks of Ataman Semyonov, whom America formerly supported. Machine gun bolts jam in the brutal cold. Fingers freeze to the metal. The platoon commander, a lieutenant, would later write in his report a brilliant, surreal phrase that would become the epigraph to this entire adventure. The Cossacks could have been Reds or were just pretending to be Reds. Think about that absurdity. They were dying for an incomprehensible station, against an incomprehensible enemy, following an incomprehensible order. Two young men from California and Michigan would remain lying in Siberian soil, becoming the living embodiment of the strategic failure later historians would call the Siberian Expedition. This is not a military history. This is a history of a complete collapse of meaning, about how good intentions, mixed with geopolitical cynicism, give birth to monsters. And the scariest part, we, looking from the 21st century, see terrible repeating patterns in this farce.
Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq.
They were all here in Siberia in 1918. This was the dress rehearsal for all of America's future foreign policy failures. And today, I invite us to unpack this murky story together to understand how world politics really works. Part 1. The Global Chessboard and Russia's Shattered Mirror. To understand how the Yanks ended up 10,000 kilometers from home in the Siberian taiga, we need to look at the global map in the autumn of 1918. The world was groaning. The First World War, the Great War, was ending, but blood was still being spilled on the Western Front. And then a catastrophe happens for the Entente. Russia, the giant ally, is consumed by chaos. The October Revolution, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, the Bolsheviks exit the war, making a separate peace with Germany. For London and Paris, this was a nightmare. The Eastern Front collapsed. Dozens of German divisions could now be transferred west to finish off the exhausted French and British troops. Something urgent had to be done. And that's when the Czechoslovak Legion appears on stage. A unique force of some 50,000 former prisoners of war from the Austro-Hungarian army, Czechs and Slovaks, who wanted to fight for the independence of their future homeland from the Habsburgs. After Brest-Litovsk, they received permission from the Soviet authorities to evacuate via Vladivostok to sail to Europe and continue the fight. Their trains stretched along the entire railway from Penza to the Pacific Ocean. And here an incident occurs that will become the formal pretext for the invasion. A conflict flares up between the Czechoslovaks and local Soviets. The legionnaires, fearing disarmament and execution, seize entire sections of the Trans-Siberian. They effectively control a giant, nearly 7,000-kilometer-long artery on which all of Siberia depends. For the Allies, this was a signal. There is a force ready to fight the Bolsheviks. We must help. But there was nothing to help with. All forces were on the Western Front. And so the idea of an intervention is born. Japan, which had long coveted resource-rich Primorai, immediately offered its troops. Britain and France, already itching to strangle Soviet power in its cradle, supported it. But there was one problem: the United States of America and its president Woodrow Wilson, an idealist, the author of the 14 Points on National Self-Determination. He opposed open intervention, sensing in it the old, rotten colonial spirit. The prospect of getting dragged into Russia's endless civil war frightened him. However, the pressure from the Allies was monstrous, and Wilson, a man of principle, made a fatal compromise. He agreed to send troops but gave them an impossible, schizophrenic directive. Remember these 3 points, they are the heart of the entire tragedy. Assist the evacuation of the Czechoslovak Corps. Guard Allied military stores in Vladivostok. Not to interfere in the internal affairs of Russia. Do you sense the contradiction? How can you assist the Czechs, who are fighting one side of a civil war, and at the same time not interfere? It was like ordering someone to put out a fire but not enter the burning house. With this absurd mandate, 7,500 American boys, mainly the 27th and 31st Infantry Regiments, stepped onto the Vladivostok piers in the summer of 1918. They didn't know their mission was doomed from the start. Part 2. The general who said no, or the loneliness of an honest man. And here we come to perhaps the most tragic figure in this story, General William Sidney Graves. He was given the role of commander of this expedition. If a careerist or an adventurer had been in his place, history might have gone differently. But Graves was a soldier of the old school, pedantic, honest, and fanatically devoted to the letter of the president's order, especially the point about non-interference. Arriving in Siberia, he very quickly understood the quagmire he was in. The Allies, the Japanese, British, French, were already playing their own games. The Japanese, instead of the promised 7,000, sent 70,000 soldiers and acted like masters, clearly aiming for annexation. The British and French openly armed and financed the Whites, in particular Admiral Kolchak, proclaimed the supreme ruler of Russia. And Kolchak himself and his allies like Ataman Grigory Semyonov and Ivan Kalmykov were, to put it mildly, odious figures. Graves, unlike the diplomats, saw everything with his own eyes. His reports to Washington are a cry from the heart. He describes how the detachments of Semyonov and Kalmykov engage in outright banditry, robberies, mass executions of peaceful peasants, torture. He calls them not an army but bandit organizations. And he, following the order not to interfere, begins to interfere. He forbids his soldiers from handing over weapons to these allies, intercedes for civilians, demanding Kolchak investigate the atrocities. Imagine his position. He is at the center of someone else's bloody meat grinder. On one side, the Bolsheviks, whom he was ordered to consider a neutral side, though their partisans were already mining the tracks. On the other, the white allies, who in his eyes were war criminals. On the third, the Japanese, who were waging a secret war against him, sowing provocations. And on the fourth, his own government in Washington, which under pressure from London and Paris began accusing Graves of excessive Bolshevism and passivity. His loneliness was absolute. He became the living embodiment of that very strategic schizophrenia. His mission was impossible by definition. Part 3. The life of the polar bears and the logistics of madness. And what about the ordinary soldiers? They called themselves polar bears and tried to somehow survive in this madhouse. From a tactical and logistical standpoint, the American contingent was a model of efficiency. They brought with them the technology of the future: automatic rifles, light bar machine guns, which later became legends of World War II, powerful Browning M1917 machine guns. Their M1911 Colt pistol became a legend in Siberia, the American Colt that can drop a horse with one shot. Their supply was brilliantly organized: warm uniforms, canned goods, millions of rounds. But all this power ran into nothing. Their main combat task became guarding sections of the Trans-Siberian. But from whom? From partisans who were indistinguishable from local peasants. From white Cossacks, who at night could rob the very same train. They patrolled endless, frozen spaces. The Corps engineers reported in horror about the condition of the railway. Due to monstrous frosts, rails snapped like glass. The section near Khabarovsk was nicknamed the Glass Road. It was a symbol. They were guarding a fragile, brittle line leading from nowhere to nowhere. The locals looked at them in amazement. These strangers didn't rob, rape, or take bribes. This was so wild for Siberia, exhausted by the arbitrariness of all authorities, that legends circulated about the Americans. They seemed like aliens from another planet, disciplined, well-fed, but absolutely lost. They held endless parades in Vladivostok, played baseball on snowy fields, and waited for orders. Orders that never came because Washington simply didn't know what to order them to do. Part 4. The economic underpinning. What were they really after? Colleagues, let's step away from the trenches for a minute and look at this story from the height of economic interests. After all, war is always the continuation of economics. What were the world powers really looking for in Siberia? Japan, its simple land and resources. The Japanese Empire dreamed of carving off the Far East for itself, creating a buffer state, controlling fisheries, timber, coal, and gold fields. Their expedition was classic colonial expansion. Great Britain and France. Their goals were twofold. First, strategically, to revive the Eastern Front against Germany and later to isolate Bolshevism. Second, economically, to recover enormous pre-war investments in Russian industry, mines, and loans, which were now up in the air after the Soviets refused to pay the Tsarist debts. Supporting the whites was an investment in recovering these assets. The United States. This is more interesting. America was relatively free of the old debts. Its interest was more geopolitical, to prevent Japan from unilaterally seizing the region. Wilson thought in global categories of a new world order. Siberia for him was not a territory but a test of his ideas. Could a region be stabilized by the force of international consensus? The answer, as we see, was a resounding no. There was also a business interest. American companies had already shown interest in Siberian resources before the revolution, and Washington didn't want to miss a potential market. So, while soldiers froze in the trenches, their own invisible war was going on in the offices of Vladivostok, Omsk, Kolchak's capital, and Washington, a war for concessions, for Russia's gold reserves, for future influence. The simple guys in fur-lined jackets were just pawns in this big game. Part 5. Agony and Withdrawal. Lessons no one heard. The end came predictably. By the end of 1919, it was clear that Kolchak's regime was crumbling. His army was retreating. He himself had lost the support of the population, disillusioned with white terror and lawlessness. The Americans, having still not resolved their main task with the Czechs, who eventually evacuated successfully, found themselves on a front line that effectively didn't exist. That very battle at Romanovka in January 20 was the last convulsion. A battle against a phantom enemy, in which the first and last American soldiers to die in direct combat in this campaign fell. In total, they lost about 200 men, mostly from disease, Spanish flu, typhus, and frostbite. In the spring of 1920, a hasty evacuation began. The Americans left with a feeling of bitter bewilderment. They had achieved nothing. The Japanese, smirking, stayed and would hold out for another 2 years until the Red Army finally kicked them out. The American Siberian Expedition ended as vaguely as it began. And the lessons? There were many, but the main one was voiced back then by General Graves himself and many analysts. You cannot get involved in a civil war on the side of one faction without understanding the local context and having a clear, achievable goal. Technological superiority, money, ideals. All of this turns to dust in the chaos of someone else's turmoil. The soldier becomes a hostage to the politician's contradictory instructions. But this lesson, as we know, was not heeded. The voices of those who believed in the power of weapons and their own exceptionalism were too loud. Siberia became the first, but far from the last, zero Afghanistan for America. It was a prototype, a black card drawn from the deck of history. And, unfortunately, its significance was seen too late. Friends, we have come a long way through the snowy expanses of this forgotten history. I sincerely thank you for reading this far. It means that you, like me, care about how this complex and often absurd world works. The history of the Siberian Expedition is not about stupid Americans or treacherous Bolsheviks. It is a universal parable about hubris, about the blindness of power, about the tragedy of little people thrown into the gears of the great game. Every time you hear in the news that some mighty power is going to bring order to a distant, incomprehensible country, remember those polar bears at Romanovka Station. Remember their frozen bolts and bewildered faces. History doesn't repeat itself literally, but it loves to rhyme. I poured my soul and many hours of research into this story. If it hooked you, made you think, do 3 simple things that will help stories like this live on. Hit the thumbs up. It's the best thanks for me. Write in the comments. What other little-known historical adventure of the 20th century would you like to learn about?
Vietnam,
The Anglo-Soviet invasion of Iran? Or maybe your own thoughts on this expedition? Subscribe to the channel. There are many more uncovered secrets, chilling plots, and deep analyses ahead that will flip your understanding of the past and present. Don't let this story sink into oblivion, as official Washington and Moscow once did. Share it, discuss it, because only by remembering the mistakes of the past can we, perhaps, avoid stepping on the same rakes in the future. Thank you for being with me. Until we meet again in the labyrinths of history.